Margaret Chung sat on the cold metal bench outside the county courthouse, her hands shaking as she read the eviction notice for the third time. The words blurred together through her tears, but the date was clear. She had exactly 7 days to leave the small apartment she had called home for the past 5 years. The morning sun felt warm on her face, but inside she felt completely frozen. Just 18 months ago, she had been a different person entirely. She had a loving husband, a steady job as a social worker, and dreams of starting a family. Now, at 34, she was completely alone in the world with less than $200 in her checking account and nowhere to go. Her husband Tom had fought cancer for 2 long years. She had watched him get weaker and weaker, spending every penny they had on treatments that the insurance company refused to cover. When he passed away 6 months ago, Margaret discovered that their medical debt was even worse than she had imagined. The hospital bills kept coming, even after the funeral. She had sold everything valuable they owned, her grandmother's jewelry, Tom's guitar collection, even their car. For the past 3 months, she had been living on credit cards and the kindness of neighbors. But kindness only goes so far when you cannot pay rent. Her landlord, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been patient for as long as she could afford to be. Yesterday, the sheriff had delivered the final notice. Margaret pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders and looked at the people walking by. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to go, carrying briefcases and talking on phones. She wondered if any of them had ever felt this lost and desperate. Probably not, she thought. Most people do not end up sitting outside a courthouse with an eviction notice, wondering if they will be sleeping in their car tonight, except she did not even have a car anymore. The courthouse doors opened with a heavy sound, and she looked up to see an older man in an expensive suit walking down the steps. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never worried about money, never wondered where his next meal would come from. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes probably cost more than Margaret made in a month back when she had a job. Richard Hawthorne had just finished signing papers for his latest real estate purchase, a small apartment building downtown that he planned to renovate and sell for twice what he paid. At 68, he owned half the commercial real estate in the city and had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. But today, even closing another successful deal could not shake the dark mood that had been following him for weeks. His doctor had been very clear during their last appointment. The chest pains were not just stress. His heart was failing, and there was no easy fix. He had maybe 5 years left, probably less. 5 years to figure out what would happen to everything he had built when he was gone. His son David was 42 and showed absolutely no interest in taking over the family business. Even worse, David seemed determined to stay single forever. No wife, no children, no one to carry on the Hawthorne name. Richard had spent his entire life building an empire, and it was all going to disappear because his son preferred designing affordable housing to making money. As Richard walked toward his car, something made him stop. The woman on the bench looked completely defeated, holding papers in her hands like they contained the worst news in the world. Her clothes were clean but old, and she had the tired look of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. Normally, Richard would have kept walking. He donated money to charities, but he did not get personally involved with people's problems. Today was different, though. Maybe it was thinking about his own mortality. Or maybe it was the way the woman reminded him of his late wife, the same dark hair, the same small frame. Whatever the reason, he found himself walking over to the bench. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentler than usual. "Are you all right?" Margaret looked up in surprise. She had not expected anyone to notice her, let alone a man who looked like he owned half the city. She quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then realized how ridiculous that sounded. "Actually, no. I'm not fine at all." Richard sat down on the bench beside her, something he had never done before in his life. "What's wrong?" Something about his kind tone made Margaret's carefully controlled emotions spill over. "I just got evicted," she said, holding up the papers. "My husband died 6 months ago, and I lost my job and I cannot pay the rent anymore. I have a week to find somewhere else to live, but I do not have any money for a deposit or first month's rent." She stopped talking, embarrassed that she had shared so much with a complete stranger. But Richard was listening with genuine interest, not the polite but distant concern she usually saw when people heard about her troubles. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked. "I was a social worker," Margaret said. "I helped families find housing, assistance, and navigate the system. It's ironic, really. I spent years helping other people avoid homelessness, and now I'm about to be homeless myself." Richard felt something click in his mind. Here was a woman who understood the housing system, who had experience helping people in difficult situations. She was educated and articulate despite her current circumstances, and she was alone in the world, with no family to complicate things. "What if I told you there might be a solution to both our problems?" he said slowly. Margaret looked at him with confusion. "I'm sorry, but I do not understand. We just met 5 minutes ago. What problem could you possibly have that I could help solve?" Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's complicated," he said. "But I have a son who needs a wife, and you need a home. Maybe we can help each other." Margaret stared at him like he had lost his mind. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "I know it sounds crazy," Richard continued, his businessman's mind already working through the possibilities. "But hear me out. I have more money than I know what to do with, and I need an heir to inherit it all. My son is a good man, but he's too stubborn to get married on his own. You're intelligent, educated, and you understand how to help people. You could be perfect for him." Margaret felt like she was having the strangest dream of her life. "Are you seriously suggesting that I marry your son? A man I have never met? This is not the 1800s. People do not arrange marriages anymore." "People do a lot of things for money," Richard said matter-of-factly. "And before you get offended, I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to offer you a way out of your situation that benefits everyone involved." Margaret stood up from the bench, clutching her eviction notice. "This is insane. You do not even know me. I could be a terrible person. I could be a criminal." "But you're not," Richard said with certainty. "I've been reading people for 40 years. You're desperate, but you're not dishonest. You're scared, but you're not weak. And most importantly, you understand what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway." Despite herself, Margaret found herself curious about this bizarre offer. "Even if I was interested, which I'm not saying I am, what makes you think your son would agree to this? Does he even know you're out here proposing to strangers on his behalf?" Richard laughed. "David has no idea what I'm doing right now. And, he's going to be furious when he finds out. But he's also practical, and he cares about helping people. If I present this the right way, he might just surprise us both." Margaret sat back down on the bench, her mind racing. This was absolutely the craziest thing anyone had ever suggested to her. But it was also the first real option she had been offered in months. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Come to dinner tonight," Richard said. "Meet David, see if you two can stand each other for 5 minutes. If there's any possibility this could work, we'll figure out the details. If not, I'll write you a check to cover your rent for 6 months while you get back on your feet." Margaret felt tears welling up again, but this time they were not entirely from despair. "Why would you do that for someone you just met?" Richard was quiet for a moment, thinking about his doctor's appointment and the empty feeling he had been carrying around for months. "Because maybe helping you is the first genuinely good thing I've done in years. And maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea might save us both." Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the city, trying to process what had just happened. A complete stranger had offered to solve all her problems in exchange for marrying his son. It sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. But the business card Richard had given her felt very real in her pocket, and so did the eviction notice in her purse. By 6 o'clock. She found herself standing outside Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. Through the large windows, she could see white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and the kind of people who never worried about money. Margaret looked down at her best dress, which was 3 years old and had a small stain near the hem that she had. Tried to cover with a safety pin. She almost turned around and left. This was ridiculous. She was about to have dinner with a millionaire who wanted her to marry his son for money. But then she remembered sleeping on her friend Lisa's couch for the past week, and how Lisa's husband had started making comments about finding her own place soon. She remembered the 27 job applications she had submitted in the past month without getting a single interview. Taking a deep breath, Margaret pushed open the restaurant door. Richard was already seated at a corner table, looking completely at ease in surroundings that made Margaret feel like an imposter. He stood up when he saw her and pulled out her chair, a gesture that reminded her painfully of her late husband, Tom. Tom had always done small things like that, treating her like she was precious even when they could barely afford groceries. "I wasn't sure you would come," Richard said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure either," Margaret admitted. "I spent all afternoon thinking you might be some kind of criminal or crazy person." Richard laughed. "I suppose from your perspective there's not much difference. Would you like some wine? The food here is excellent." Margaret nodded, though she rarely drank alcohol anymore. It was too expensive, and it reminded her of happier times when she and Tom would share a bottle on Friday nights while planning their future together. The waiter brought over a bottle that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. "So," Richard said after they had ordered, "tell me about yourself. What was your life like before everything fell apart?" The question was direct but not unkind. Margaret found herself talking about her work as a social worker, how she had loved helping families navigate the complex system of housing assistance and government programs. She talked about Tom, their small apartment filled with secondhand furniture and big dreams, and how they had planned to have children once they got more financially stable. "We kept saying we would start trying for a baby next year," she said, quietly. "Next year when Tom got promoted, next year when we saved more money, next year when we bought a house. We thought we had all the time in the world." Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a gentle question. Margaret realized she had not talked about Tom this openly with anyone since the funeral. Most people either avoided the subject or tried to rush her through her grief with platitudes about how he was in a better place now. "What about you?" Margaret asked. "What made you think of this arrangement? Do you always solve problems by bribing strangers to marry your family members?" Richard smiled ruefully. "This is definitely a first for me, but I'm running out of conventional options." He took a sip of wine and seemed to be deciding how much to tell her. "My son David is 42 years old and shows absolutely no interest in settling down. He's a good man, but he's stubborn as a mule and twice as independent." "Maybe he just hasn't found the right person," Margaret suggested. Maybe he's so busy trying to prove he's nothing like his old man that he's forgotten how to let people get close to him." Richard's voice carried a weight of old regrets. "His mother died when he was 15. Cancer, just like your husband. I threw myself into work afterward, and I'm afraid I wasn't much of a father during the years when he needed me most." Margaret felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this wealthy man who clearly had his own share of pain. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult for both of you." "It was. And now I'm facing my own mortality, and all I can think about is how empty this whole life will be if there's no one to remember it. No grandchildren to tell stories to, no family traditions to pass down. Just a bunch of real estate that will get sold off to the highest bidder." The waiter brought their meals, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Margaret had to admit the food was incredible, better than anything she had eaten in months. But she couldn't stop thinking about the surreal nature of their conversation. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Why me? I mean, if you want your son to get married so badly, surely there are women in your social circle who would be interested. Wealthy women, educated women, women who wouldn't need to be bribed." Richard set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Because those women would want David for his money, not for who he is. They would see him as a ticket to a comfortable life, not as a person worth caring about. You, on the other hand, are in a position where you need help, but you're not greedy. You understand what real problems look like. How can you possibly know that about me? We met this morning. Because you spent 2 years watching your husband die and bankrupting yourself to try to save him. Because you worked helping poor families even though it didn't pay well. Because when I offered to help you, your first instinct was to ask what. The catch was not to grab the money and run. Richard leaned forward. Most importantly, because you're here having dinner with me instead of dismissing this whole idea as insane, which means you're desperate enough to consider anything, but smart enough to want to understand it first. Margaret felt uncomfortable with how clearly this stranger seemed to see her situation. What exactly are you proposing? I mean, specifically, marriage is a big deal, even a fake one. It wouldn't be fake, Richard said firmly. It would be real. In every legal sense. You would live together, present yourselves as a married couple, and hopefully, eventually, have children together. I'm not asking you to pretend to be in love, but I am asking you to build a real partnership. And what do I get out of this besides solving your family succession problem? Richard pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. A house? A beautiful house in the Maple Grove neighborhood, fully paid for, in your name regardless of what happens with the marriage. A monthly allowance of $5,000 for personal expenses. Full health insurance. And if you have a child within? 2 years, a trust fund of $2 million that can never be touched by anyone but you. Margaret stared at the papers in front of her. The house photos showed a gorgeous 2-story home with a garden and a white picket fence, the kind of place she and Tom had dreamed of buying someday. The financial terms were more money than she had ever imagined having. This is insane, she whispered. People don't do things like this. Desperate people do desperate things, Richard said gently. I'm desperate to see my family line continue and my son happy. You're desperate for stability and security. Maybe we can help each other. Get what we need. Margaret looked around the restaurant at the other diners, all of them chatting and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. 6 months ago, she had been one of those people. She had thought she understood how the world worked, what was normal and what was crazy. What if your son hates me? She asked. What if we can't stand each other? Then we figure out another arrangement. I'm not asking you to fall in love, Margaret. I'm asking you to give this a chance and see what happens. David is a good man. He's kind, he's intelligent, and he cares about helping people just like you do. You might find that you actually like each other. Margaret closed the folder and looked Richard in the eyes. I need to think about this. This is the biggest decision I've ever had to make. Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, you have 6 days before you get evicted. And winter is coming soon. The homeless shelters in this city are already overcrowded. As they left the restaurant, Richard handed Margaret another business card. My personal number is on the back. Call me when you've decided. And Margaret, whatever you choose, I meant what I said about helping with your rent. You don't have to agree to marry David to keep from being homeless. Walking back to Lisa's apartment, Margaret felt like she was living in someone else's life. Everything that had seemed certain and predictable had been turned upside down in the span of a single day. But for the first time in months, she had options. Strange, terrifying, possibly wonderful options. She had a choice to make, and whatever she decided would change everything. Margaret spent 2 sleepless nights thinking about Richard's offer. She walked around the city for hours, imagining what it would be like to live in that beautiful house, to never worry about money again, to have the security she had lost when Tom died. But she also couldn't stop thinking about what it would mean to marry a complete stranger. Even if it was just a business arrangement, on the 3rd day she called Richard. I'll meet him, she said simply. But I'm not promising anything beyond that. That's all I'm asking for, Richard replied, and she could hear the relief in his voice. Can you come to the house tonight, 7 o'clock? The Hawthorne estate was even more impressive than Margaret had imagined. The iron gates opened automatically as Richard's car approached, revealing a long driveway lined with oak trees. The house itself looked like something from a magazine. 3 stories of red brick and white columns, with perfectly manicured gardens stretching in every direction. This is where you grew up? Margaret asked as they pulled up to the front entrance. David did, Richard said. I bought this place when he was 10, after his mother died. I thought a big house would somehow make up for everything we had lost. I'm not sure it worked. A woman in her 50s opened the front door before they could knock. She had kind eyes and flour on her apron, and she smiled warmly at Margaret despite her obvious curiosity. This is Helen, Richard explained. She's been taking care of this family for 15 years. Helen, this is Margaret Chun. It's nice to meet you, dear, Helen said, shaking Margaret's hand. David is in his study. He's been pacing around like a caged tiger ever since his father told him you were coming. Richard led Margaret through rooms filled with expensive furniture and family photos. She caught glimpses of a younger David in the pictures, a serious-looking boy who grew into a tall, dark-haired man with his father's strong jaw but softer eyes. They found David in a room lined with bookshelves, standing at a large window that overlooked the gardens. He turned when they entered, and Margaret was surprised by how normal he looked. She had expected someone arrogant or cold, but David just looked tired and slightly embarrassed. David, Richard said, this is Margaret Chun. David stepped forward and extended his hand. I'm sorry about this, he said immediately. My father has a tendency to meddle in things that are none of his business. I hope he hasn't made you feel uncomfortable. Margaret shook his hand, noticing that his grip was firm but gentle. Actually, your father may have saved my life. I was about to be evicted when we met. David shot a look at Richard that was part anger, part concern. Dad, you didn't tell me she was in crisis. This makes everything worse. How does it make it worse? Richard asked innocently. Because now it looks like we're taking advantage of someone who's desperate, David said. He turned to Margaret. I'm really sorry. If you need help with housing, I work with several non-profit organizations that assist people in your situation. You don't need to get involved in whatever scheme my father has cooked up. Margaret found herself smiling for the first time in days. You know, that's exactly what I thought you would say. What do you mean? Your father told me you design affordable housing and work with non-profits. He said you care more about helping people than making money. I didn't believe him because, well, rich people's kids don't usually turn out that way. David looked surprised. You researched me? I Googled you, Margaret admitted. I found articles about the low-income housing projects you've designed, and the community center you donated in your mother's name. You're not what I expected, Richard cleared his throat. Why don't I leave you two alone to talk? Helen is making dinner. We'll eat in an hour. After Richard left, an awkward silence settled over the room. David gestured toward two chairs near the fireplace, and they both sat down. So, David said finally, this is probably the strangest conversation either of us has ever had. Margaret laughed. Definitely the strangest for me. Though my life has gotten pretty weird lately, so the bar was already pretty low. Can I ask what happened? I mean, if you don't mind talking about it. Margaret found herself telling David the same story she had told Richard, about Tom's illness, the medical bills, losing her job, and facing eviction. But talking to David felt different. He listened with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like her words actually mattered. I'm sorry, he said when she finished. That's an incredible amount of loss to deal with in such a short time. And I'm sorry my father approached you when you were vulnerable. That wasn't right. Actually, I think it might have been exactly right, Margaret said. I mean, the timing was perfect from my perspective. If he had approached me 6 months ago, when I still had a job and a home, I would have thought he was insane, David smiled. You still think he's insane? You're just desperate enough to consider it anyway. Exactly. Margaret studied David's face, trying to read his expression. What about you? What do you think about all this? David was quiet for a long moment. Honestly? I think my father is panicking about his mortality and trying to control things he can't control. He's terrified that everything he's built will disappear when he dies, so he's trying to force me into the life he thinks I should have. And what life do you think you should have? I don't know, David said, and the honesty in his voice surprised her. I've spent so much time trying not to be like my father that I'm not sure who I actually am. I know I don't want to spend my life accumulating wealth just for the sake of having it. I know I want my work to matter, to help people who actually need help. But beyond that, he shrugged. I'm 42 years old and I feel like I'm still figuring it out, Margaret nodded. I understand that feeling. 6 months ago, I thought I had my whole life planned out. Tom and I were going to have kids, buy a house, grow old together. Now I'm sitting in a mansion talking to a stranger about a fake marriage. And somehow that seems like the most reasonable option I have. It wouldn't be fake, David said quietly. I mean, if we did this, it would be a real marriage. Maybe not. A traditional one, but real in the legal sense. We'd be making a commitment to each other, even if it started as a business arrangement. Would that bother you? Being married to someone you barely know? David considered this. It would be strange. Definitely. But I've been alone for a long time, and it hasn't made me particularly happy. Maybe there's something to be said for partnership, even if it doesn't start with romance. They talked for another hour, covering everything from their childhoods to their favorite books to their opinions on whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Margaret was surprised by how easy the conversation felt, how much they seemed to have in common despite their very different backgrounds, when Helen called them. For dinner, Margaret realized she had completely forgotten about the bizarre circumstances that brought them together. She had just been talking to David, enjoying his dry sense of humor and thoughtful observations about the world. Dinner was surprisingly comfortable. Richard mostly stayed quiet, letting Margaret and David continue their conversation. They talked about David's architecture work, Margaret's experiences as a social worker, and their shared frustration with systems that seemed designed to keep poor people poor. You know, David said as they finished dessert, if we did decide to try this arrangement, I think we could actually help each other. Not just financially, but in other ways too. I've been thinking about starting a foundation focused on affordable housing. Someone with your background in social work would be invaluable in designing programs that actually work. Margaret felt a spark of excitement for the first time in months. I've always wanted to work on policy-level changes instead of just helping people navigate broken systems. If we had the resources to actually fix some of these problems instead of just putting band-aids on them, we could make a real difference. David finished. Richard watched this exchange with growing satisfaction. These two were already talking like partners, already imagining a future together. Maybe his crazy plan wasn't so crazy after all. After dinner, David walked Margaret out to Richard's car. So what do you think? He asked. Is this the worst idea in the history of bad ideas, or just the second worst? Margaret laughed. I think it might be the best worst idea I've ever heard. Which probably says something terrible about the state of my life right now. Or maybe it says something good about both of our willingness to take a chance on something. Unconventional. David paused. I know this is a lot to think about. Take all the time you need. As Richard drove her back to the city, Margaret stared out the window at the lights of houses where families were settling in for the night. Your son is a good man, she said finally. Yes, he is. Do you think you could be happy with him? Margaret thought about David's genuine smile, his obvious concern for her situation, and the way he had listened to her talk about Tom without trying to rush her through her grief. I think we could be happy together. Maybe not in the way people usually mean when they talk about marriage, but in our own way. Sometimes, Richard said, our own way is the best way. That night, Margaret made her decision. She would marry David Hawthorne, not because she loved him, but because she could see the possibility of building something real and meaningful together. It was the biggest leap of faith she had ever taken. 3 days after their first meeting, Margaret moved into the guest house on the Hawthorne estate. It was a small cottage behind the main house, complete with a kitchen, bedroom, and living room decorated in soft blues and whites. After months of sleeping on Lisa's couch, having her own space felt like a luxury beyond measure. This is just temporary, David had explained when he showed her around. Until we figure out if this arrangement is going to work. I want you to feel comfortable and not pressured into anything. Margaret appreciated his thoughtfulness, but she also noticed the careful distance he maintained. They were like two people circling each other, both curious and cautious at the same time. The first week was awkward. Margaret would see David through the windows of the main house, working at his computer or talking on the phone. Sometimes he would wave, and she would wave back, but they didn't seek each other out. She spent her days applying for jobs and trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. On Thursday evening, there was a knock at her door. David stood on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee and looking slightly embarrassed. "Helen made way too much dinner," he said. "I thought maybe you'd like to join me. If you haven't eaten already." Margaret had been surviving on peanut butter, sandwiches, and instant noodles, too proud to ask for help with groceries even though she was essentially broke. "That sounds wonderful," she said. They ate in David's kitchen, which was smaller and more comfortable than the formal dining room. "Where they had dinner with Richard?" David had cooked pasta with vegetables from the garden, and it was simple but delicious. "You cook?" Margaret asked. "Helen taught me when I was a teenager. She said no man should depend on other people to feed him," David smiled. "She was probably thinking about my father, who once tried to make scrambled eggs and nearly burned down the kitchen." Margaret laughed. "My husband was the cook in our family. I can make about 5 things well, and pasta is one of them. We could have a very limited but tasty menu if we ever actually go through with this marriage thing." The words hung in the air between them. They hadn't talked about the arrangement since that first night, both of them seemingly content to let the idea settle without pressure. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "What was he like, your husband?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Most people avoided asking about Tom, afraid of making her sad. But David's question felt genuine, not like he was trying to rush her through her grief or compare himself to a dead man. "He was the kind of person who made everyone around him feel important," she said finally. "He remembered details about people's lives, asked about their kids, their hobbies. He could talk to anyone, the homeless guy outside the grocery store, the bank president, it didn't matter. Tom treated everyone with the same respect. He sounds like a good man. He was. But he was also stubborn and messy and terrible with money. He once spent our vacation fund on a guitar he found at a pawn shop because he felt sorry for the guy who was selling it." Margaret smiled at the memory. "I was furious at the time, but now I miss even the things about him that drove me crazy." David nodded. "I think that's what real love looks like. Missing someone's flaws as much as their strengths." "Have you ever been in love?" Margaret asked. David hesitated. "I thought I was once. Her name was Jessica. We were engaged for about 6 months. When I was 35? But looking back, I think we were both in love with the idea of being in love rather than actually being in love with each other. What happened? She wanted the life that came with being a Hawthorne more than she wanted me specifically. When I told her I wanted to scale back my involvement in my father's business and focus on nonprofit work, she started talking about how I was throwing away my potential. The final straw was when she suggested I was having some kind of midlife crisis and needed therapy to get my priorities straight. Margaret winced. That must have hurt. It did. But it also made me realize that I'd rather be alone than be with someone who didn't understand what mattered to me. David looked at Margaret across the table. That's part of why this arrangement doesn't seem completely insane to me. At least we're being honest about what we want from each other. After dinner, David offered to show Margaret around the gardens. They walked along stone paths between beds of roses and herbs, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret learned that David had designed the garden himself, focusing on plants that would attract birds and butterflies. She told him about the tiny balcony garden she and Tom had maintained, growing tomatoes and basil in recycled containers. I miss having dirt under my fingernails, she said, kneeling down to examine a patch of lavender. There's something about growing things that makes everything else seem more manageable. You could plant whatever you want here, David said. Helen would probably love the help. She's been complaining that the garden is too much work for one person. They ended up sitting on a bench near a small fountain, watching the sun set over the trees. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of jasmine. "Can I tell you something weird?" Margaret said, "Everything about this situation is weird." "What's one more thing?" "I feel guilty for being happy." "Not happy exactly, but hopeful, content. It's been so long since I felt like things might actually work out okay." She picked at a loose thread on her sweater. "Part of me feels like I'm betraying Tom's memory by even considering moving on." David was quiet for a long moment. "My mother used to say that love isn't a limited resource. Loving someone new doesn't mean you love the person you lost any less. It just means your heart has room for both. Your father told me she died when you were 15. That must have been terrible." "It was. But she packed a lot of wisdom into the time she had. She also used to say that life is too short and too unpredictable to spend it waiting for perfect circumstances." David glanced at Margaret. "I think she would have liked this plan, actually. The practical aspects of it would have appealed to her." They started having dinner together every few days after that. Sometimes David would cook, sometimes Margaret would, and sometimes they would order takeout and eat it on the porch of the guest house. Their conversations ranged from serious topics like their work and their dreams to silly debates about movies and music. Margaret learned that David was surprisingly funny in a quiet, observant way. He noticed details about people and situations that made his stories entertaining even when nothing dramatic happened. He learned that Margaret had a talent for seeing solutions to problems that seemed impossible, and that she could make him laugh even when he was stressed about work. 2 weeks into their trial period, Margaret was reading on the porch when David appeared with a laptop and a stack of papers. "Want to help me with something?" he asked. "I'm working on a proposal for a new affordable housing project, and I could use someone with your background to review it." Margaret found herself drawn into the project immediately. David's architectural plans were innovative and beautiful, but she could see places where the social services component could be improved. They spent the entire afternoon working together, bouncing ideas off each other and refining the proposal. "This is really good," Margaret said as they finished. "You're not just designing buildings, you're designing communities. Places where people can actually build stable lives. That's the goal. But it's harder than it sounds. There are so many moving pieces: zoning laws, funding sources, community buy-in. I get frustrated sometimes with how slow the process is." "Maybe that's where we could really help each other," Margaret said. "You understand the big picture and the long-term vision. I understand how to navigate bureaucracy and get things done day by day. Together we might actually be able to move mountains." David looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You know, when my father first proposed this idea, I thought it was about him wanting grandchildren and me needing to get married. But maybe it's really about finding someone who wants to build something meaningful together. Is that what you want?" Margaret asked. "To build something together?" "I think it might be," David said. "The question is, what do you want?" Margaret thought about the question as they walked back toward the main house. What did she want? Security, certainly. A home, a future, the chance to do work that mattered. But she was starting to realize she wanted something else too: partnership. The feeling of working toward shared goals with someone who understood her values. "I want to matter," she said finally. "I want my life to count for something more than just surviving day to day. And I want to work with someone who sees the world the way I do, who wants to fix things instead of just complaining about them." "I think we could do that," David said. "Build something that matters. Even if it starts as a business arrangement, maybe it could become something real." That night, Margaret called Richard to tell him they wanted to move forward with the arrangement. But as she hung up the phone, she realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about solving her housing crisis anymore. She was starting to genuinely care about David, to look forward to their conversations and value his opinions. It scared her a little how quickly she was becoming attached to this new life. But it also gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something beautiful from the ashes of everything she had lost. After 3 weeks of dinners, garden walks, and late-night conversations, Margaret and David had settled into a comfortable routine. She was starting to feel like the guest house was actually home, and he was beginning to look forward to their evening talks more than anything else in his day. They were both surprised by how natural their friendship felt, how easily they could spend hours discussing everything from architecture to social policy to their favorite childhood memories. Then Richard decided it was time to make things official. Margaret was reading in the garden when David appeared with a grim expression and a thick manila envelope in his hand. "My father wants to see us in his office," he said. "He has papers for us to sign." The office was as intimidating as Margaret had expected: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive desk that made Richard look like a judge presiding over a courtroom. 3 copies of a legal document sat on the desk, each one thick enough to be a small book. "Sit down, both of you," Richard said, his tone more businesslike than Margaret had heard before. "It's time we formalized this arrangement." Margaret picked up one of the contracts and flipped through it, her heart sinking with each page. The document was written in dense legal language that made her head spin, but the basic terms were clear enough. Marriage within 60 days, cohabitation in the main house within 6 months, a child born within 24 months of the wedding. Date: financial penalties if either party failed to meet their obligations. "Dad," David said, his voice tight with anger, "what is this?" "It's a prenuptial agreement that protects everyone's interests," Richard replied calmly. "Margaret gets the financial security she needs. You get a wife and hopefully children, and I get the assurance that the family line will continue." Margaret felt sick as she read more of the contract. There were clauses about public appearances, social obligations, and even specifications about where they would live and how they would present themselves to Richard's business associates. It read less like a marriage agreement and more like a business merger with very personal terms. "This is insane," David said, standing up abruptly. "You've turned a marriage into a corporate contract. These aren't terms for a partnership. They're instructions for performing in a play." "Marriage is a legal and financial arrangement," Richard said firmly. "Romance is optional, but the practical aspects need to be clearly defined. Margaret, you understand this, don't you? You need guarantees that your future is secure." Margaret looked up from the contract, feeling like she was seeing Richard clearly for the first time, the kind, concerned man who had offered to help her. In her darkest hour was gone, replaced by a businessman negotiating a deal. "Mr. Hawthorne, some of these terms, they're very controlling. What if David and I need more time to adjust to living together? What if having children takes longer? Then 2 years? What if we decide this isn't working? Then you forfeit the financial benefits and return to your previous situation," Richard said bluntly. "This isn't a charity, Margaret. It's an exchange of services. You provide David with companionship and me with an heir, and in return you receive financial security for life." The cold calculation in his voice made Margaret's stomach turn. She had known this was a business arrangement, but hearing it spelled out so clinically made her feel like she was selling herself. David slammed his copy of the contract down on the desk. "This is exactly why I've never wanted to get married. Everything has to be about control and manipulation with you. You can't just let people make their own choices and see what happens. People's choices led you to 42 years of bachelorhood and her to homelessness," Richard snapped. "Sometimes adults need guidance to make decisions that are actually good for them." "Guidance?" David's voice rose. "This isn't guidance, it's coercion. You're basically buying Margaret a husband and me a wife, whether we want it or not." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to them argue. The past 3 weeks had felt so natural, so hopeful. She had started to believe that maybe she and David could build something real together, based on friendship and shared values. But this contract reduced everything to a transaction, stripping away the possibility of genuine affection. "I need some air," she said quietly. Standing up and walking out of the office, she found herself in the garden, sitting on the bench where she and David had shared so many conversations. The lavender she had admired on her first night was in full bloom now, filling the air with its sweet scent. But instead of bringing her peace, It reminded her of how much she had come to love this place, and how quickly it could all disappear. David found her there 20 minutes later, looking as shaken as she felt. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting down beside her. "I had no idea he was going to spring something like that on us." The way he presented it makes the whole thing feel dirty and manipulative. "Maybe it is," Margaret said softly. "Maybe I've been fooling myself into thinking this could be something more than a business deal." "It is more than that," David said firmly. "At least it has been for me. These past few weeks, getting to know you, working together, talking about our dreams, that's been real. That's been the best part of my life in years." Margaret looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "But how can we build something real when it's all based on a contract? When your father is essentially paying me to marry you?" "We ignore the contract," David said. "We forget about my father's timeline and his demands and his threats. We take as much time as we need to figure out if this is something we actually want. And if he cuts off the financial support, if he throws me out?" David was quiet for a moment. "Then we figure it out together. I have my own money, Margaret. Not as much as my father, but enough. I can make sure you're never homeless again, regardless of what happens between us." "That's not the point," Margaret said, though she was touched by his offer. "The point is that I wanted to believe we were choosing each other, not just fulfilling the terms of a business deal. I wanted to believe that what was growing between us was genuine." "It is genuine," David insisted. "My feelings for you have nothing to do with my father's contract. Yes, this whole situation started because of his scheming, but what's happening between us now, that's real." Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something made her answer it anyway. "Margaret Chun?" The voice was sharp and familiar, though she couldn't place it immediately. "Yes, this is Margaret." "This is Patricia Williams, Tom's sister. We need to talk." Margaret's blood ran cold. Patricia had barely spoken to her since Tom's funeral, blaming Margaret for not doing enough to save her brother. "Patricia, I don't think we have anything to discuss." "Oh, we do. I just saw a very interesting article online about the Hawthorne family and their business dealings. Imagine my surprise when I saw a photo of you coming out of their estate. Tell me, Margaret, how long after my brother died did you start gold digging?" Margaret felt like she had been slapped. "It's not like that. You don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly. My brother bankrupted himself trying to save his life while you were planning your next move. How much are they paying you to play house with their son? How much is Tom's memory worth to you?" "Patricia, please, save it. I'm calling the local newspaper tonight. I think people should know what kind of woman pretends to grieve while shopping for a richer husband." The line went dead, and Margaret stared at her phone in horror. "What's wrong?" David asked, seeing the color drain from her face. Margaret told him about the call, watching his expression grow more concerned with each word. "She can't prove anything scandalous because there isn't anything scandalous," David said. "We're two adults who met and are considering marriage. There's nothing illegal or immoral about that. But she can make it sound terrible. She can make it look like I'm some kind of opportunist who used my husband's death to manipulate a wealthy family." Margaret buried her face in her hands. "Maybe she's right. Maybe that's exactly what I am." "Stop it," David said firmly. "You're a woman who lost everything and accepted help when it was offered. You're someone who's trying to build a new life after a tragedy. There's nothing shameful about that." But Margaret was spiraling into self-doubt and panic. What if the newspaper runs a story? What if it affects your reputation, your business? What if your father decides I'm more trouble than I'm worth? Then we deal with it, David said. Together, but Margaret, you can't let other people's opinions determine how you live your life. I've made that mistake before, and it only leads to regret. That evening, as Margaret sat alone in the guest house, she felt more confused than ever. The contract had made their arrangement feel cold and calculated. Patricia's call had made her question her own motives. And yet, when she thought about the possibility of leaving, of never having another conversation with David or working together on projects that mattered, her heart ached that she was falling for him, she realized. Despite the bizarre circumstances, despite the financial arrangements, despite all the complications, she was developing real feelings for David Hawthorne. The question was whether that made everything better or infinitely more complicated. Outside her window, she could see lights on in David's study, where he was probably working late as usual. Despite all the complications and doubts, Margaret and David decided to move forward with the wedding. They had long conversations about Patricia's threats and Richard's controlling contract, ultimately deciding that they couldn't let other people's expectations and manipulations determine their choices. "We'll do this our way," David had said one evening as they walked through the garden. "Small, simple, and focused on what we want to build together, not what anyone else expects from us." "Are you sure?" Margaret had asked. "Once we're married, everything becomes more complicated. Your father's contract, the expectations, the pressure to have children quickly." "The contract doesn't matter," David replied. "What matters is what we decide together. We can take as much time as we need to figure out our relationship, regardless of what my father wants." They planned a small ceremony in the garden with only Richard, Helen, and David's childhood friend Michael as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Helen had helped her pick out, and David wore a gray suit that made his eyes look even more serious than usual. The morning of the wedding, Margaret woke up feeling strangely calm. She had expected to be nervous or sad, thinking about how different this was from the wedding she had imagined having with Tom. Instead, she felt hopeful. She was marrying a man she genuinely cared about, someone who shared her values and made her laugh. It wasn't the love story she had planned, but it felt like the beginning of something good. Helen knocked on the guest house door at 9 o'clock, carrying a small bouquet of lavender and white roses from the garden. "From David," she said with a smile. "He cut them himself this morning." The ceremony was short and sweet. The minister, a kind older man who had known David since childhood, kept the vows simple and traditional. When David slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, she was surprised by how right it felt. This man had become her partner, her friend, and now her husband. "You may kiss the bride," the minister said. David and Margaret looked at each other for a moment, both suddenly aware that this was their first kiss. It was gentle and brief, more like a promise than a passionate declaration, but it felt sincere. Richard hosted a small lunch reception on the terrace, and for a few hours everything felt perfectly normal. Michael told embarrassing stories about David's college years. Helen fussed over the food, and Margaret found herself relaxing and enjoying the celebration. It wasn't until that evening, after the guests had gone home and they were alone in the main house, that the reality of their situation hit them. "So," David said as they stood in the living room, "I guess we're married now." "I guess we are," Margaret replied. "This is probably the strangest wedding night in history." They had talked about the living arrangements beforehand. Margaret would move into the main house as Richard's contract required, but she would have her own bedroom until they both felt comfortable with something more intimate. David had converted his mother's old sitting room into a beautiful bedroom for Margaret, complete with a reading nook and a view of the garden. "Thank you," Margaret said when he showed her the room. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "I wanted you to feel at home here," David said. "This house has felt too empty for too long. Having you here makes it feel alive again." They sat on the small couch in Margaret's sitting area, both of them aware that this conversation was important. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Are you happy? About getting married, I mean. Not just relieved or resigned, but actually happy?" David considered the question seriously. "Yes, I think I am. I know it sounds strange, considering how this all started, but I'm happier than I've been in years. You've become one of my favorite people, Margaret. I look forward to seeing you every day, to hearing your thoughts about things, to working on projects together. If that's not happiness, it's close enough." "I feel the same way," Margaret admitted. "I was terrified that this would feel like I was betraying Tom's memory, but it doesn't. It feels like I'm honoring the life he would have wanted me to have, a life with purpose and partnership and hope for the future." David reached over and took her hand. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight. We can take this as slowly as we need to. Margaret squeezed his hand. What if we never fall in love the way people expect married couples to love each other? What if we always feel more like very good friends who happen to be legally committed to each other? Then we'll be very good friends who happen to be legally committed to each other, David said with a smile. There are worse ways to live. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing thoughts about their hopes for their marriage and their fears about the future. When Margaret finally went to bed in her new room, she felt more at peace than she had in months, but her peace was shattered. The next morning, when David appeared at her bedroom door with his laptop and a grim expression, "You need to see this," he said, setting the laptop on her bed. Margaret looked at the screen and felt her heart sink. The headline read, "Local widow marries millionaire's son months after husband's death." Below it was a photo of her and David leaving the courthouse where they had gotten their marriage license, and another photo of her walking through the gardens of the estate. The article was everything Patricia had threatened and worse. It portrayed Margaret as a gold digger who had manipulated a grieving wealthy family, taking advantage of their kindness to secure her financial future. It quoted sources close to the family saying that Margaret had pursued David aggressively and that the marriage was purely financial. "Most of this is lies," Margaret said, reading through the article with growing horror. "They make it sound like I seduced you for money." "I know it's lies," David said. "Anyone who knows us knows it's lies, but the damage is already done. My office has been getting calls all morning from reporters wanting comments." Margaret closed the laptop and buried her face in her hands. "This is going to ruin everything. Your reputation, your business relationships, your father's standing in the community." "My father is the least of my concerns right now," David said firmly. "I'm worried about you. How are you holding up?" Before Margaret could answer, Richard burst into the room without knocking, holding a copy of the newspaper and looking furious. "This is a disaster," he said. "My lawyer is already getting calls from reporters. The Business Association wants to know if the allegations are true. This kind of scandal could affect every deal I have in progress." "Dad, calm down," David said. "It's just gossip. It'll blow over in a few days." "Gossip?" Richard's voice rose. "This article makes our family look like we buy wives, like we buy real estate. It makes Margaret look like a fortune hunter, and you look like a fool who got taken advantage of." Margaret stood up, anger overriding her embarrassment. "Mr. Hawthorne, I understand you're upset, but I won't sit here and listen to you talk about our marriage like it's a public relations problem, isn't it?" Richard shot back. "You knew this arrangement would generate gossip. You should have been more careful about appearances." "More careful?" Margaret's voice was getting louder. "I've been living like a nun for 6 months. I haven't done anything wrong except accept help when I needed it and marry a man I genuinely care about." "That's exactly the problem," Richard said coldly. "You care about him. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, not a romance. Business arrangements are clean and predictable. Romance makes people emotional and unpredictable." David stepped between his father and Margaret. "That's enough. Margaret is my wife now, and I won't have you talking to her like she's an employee who made a mistake." "Your wife?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You've known her for 2 months. You married her because I backed you into a corner, not because you love her." The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt all the blood drain from her face as the truth of Richard's statement hit her. David had married her because of his father's pressure and her desperate circumstances, not because he had chosen her freely. "Is that true?" she asked David quietly. "Did you only marry me because your father forced you to?" David looked stricken. "Margaret, it's not that simple. It's a yes or no question," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you marry me because you wanted to or because you felt like you had to?" David was quiet for a long moment, and his silence was answer enough. Margaret walked to the closet and pulled out the small suitcase she had brought with her from her old life. "I need some time to think," she said. "I'm going to stay with my friend Lisa for a few days." "Margaret, please don't leave," David said. "Let's talk about this." But Margaret was already packing her few belongings. moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had packed in a hurry too many times before. "I've been fooling myself," she said without looking at him. "I thought we were building something real, but I was just another problem you were trying to solve." "That's not true," David protested. "My feelings for you are real. The fact that this situation started because of external pressure doesn't change that." Margaret stopped packing and looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Doesn't it? How can I ever know if you care about me for who I am, or just because I'm convenient? How can I trust my own feelings when they're all mixed up with gratitude and desperation?" She zipped up her suitcase and headed for the door. "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not someone." Margaret had been staying at Lisa's apartment for 3 days when she made the discovery that changed everything. She was sitting on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, staring at a pregnancy test that showed 2 clear lines. She was pregnant. Her hands shook as she held the test, reading the instructions again to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. But there was no mistake. The timing made sense. It had happened on their wedding night, when she and David had finally given in to the feelings that had been building between them for weeks. The irony was overwhelming. After all of Richard's demands about producing an heir within 2 years, she was carrying his grandchild just 1 month after the wedding. But instead of feeling like a victory, it felt like the most complicated situation imaginable. Lisa found her there an hour later, still sitting on the bathroom floor in her pajamas. "Margaret? What's wrong?" Lisa knelt down beside her, then saw the pregnancy test. "Oh my God, are you ... "I'm pregnant," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm carrying David's baby, and I don't even know if our marriage is real or just a business arrangement." Lisa helped her up and guided her to the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Okay, let's think about this step by step. How do you feel about being pregnant?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Scared, confused, but also—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Happy, I think. Tom and I wanted children so badly. We tried for 2 years before he got sick. I never thought I'd have the chance to be a mother." "And how do you feel about David being the father?" That was the question that had been keeping Margaret awake for 3 nights straight. "I don't know. I care about him, Lisa. Maybe I even love him. But I don't know if my feelings are real or just gratitude mixed up with loneliness. And I don't know if his feelings for me are real either." Lisa made them both tea and sat down across from Margaret. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Part of me wants to run away and raise this baby somewhere far from here, where no one knows about the weird circumstances. Part of me wants to go back to David and try to figure out if we can make this work. And part of me thinks I should tell Richard about the pregnancy and let him take care of everything financially while I stay out of his family drama. What does your heart tell you to do?" Margaret started crying then, all the emotions she had been holding back for days finally spilling over. "My heart tells me that I love David and I want to go home to him. But my brain tells me that I can't trust my own feelings because I was desperate when I met him. How do I know the difference between love and gratitude? How do I know if he married me because he wanted to or because he felt sorry for me?" The next morning, Margaret decided she had to tell David about the pregnancy, regardless of how confused she felt about their relationship. She called him, and he answered on the first ring. "Margaret? Thank God. Are you okay? I've been going crazy worrying about you." "I'm fine," she said, "but I need to see you. Can you meet me somewhere? Not at your father's house?" They met at a small coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where they could talk privately without being recognized. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said as soon as she sat down. "I'm sorry about what my father said, and I'm sorry about the newspaper article, and I'm sorry that you felt like you had to leave." "David, I need to tell you something important," Margaret said, her heart pounding. "I'm pregnant." David stared at her in shock, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. We're going to have a baby?" "Yes, I found out 3 days ago. I've been trying to figure out what to do about it." David set down his cup and reached across the table to take her hands. What do you mean, what to do about it? This is wonderful news. We're going to be parents. Is it wonderful? Margaret asked. Or is it just another obligation? Another part of your father's business plan that you're stuck with? David's face fell. Margaret, you can't seriously think that's how I feel about this, about you, about our baby. I don't know what to think, Margaret said. Your father made it very clear that this marriage was a transaction. You get a wife, I get financial security, he gets an heir. Now I'm pregnant, which means his plan worked perfectly. How do I know this isn't exactly what you all wanted from the beginning? Because you know me, David said desperately. You've spent weeks getting to know me. You know, I'm not the kind of person who would manipulate someone into having my child. For money, Margaret pulled her hands away from his. Do I know you? We've known each other for 2 months, David, 2 months in very unusual circumstances. Maybe what I think I know about you is just what you wanted me to see. David looked like she had slapped him. That's not fair. Everything between us has been genuine. Every conversation, every moment we've shared, that's been real. Has it? Or have you just been a better actor than your father? They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them struggling with emotions they couldn't quite name. Finally, David spoke. What can I do to prove to you that my feelings are real? What can I do to make you trust me again? Margaret wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. I don't know if you can. I think I need to figure out who I am when I'm not desperate for help. I need to know that I can take care of myself and this baby without depending on anyone else. You don't have to do this alone, David said. Whatever you decide about us, about our marriage, I want to be part of this child's life. I want to support you both. With your father's money? With my money. I have my own savings, my own business. I can take care of you and our baby without any help from my father. Margaret shook her head. That's not the point. The point is that I need to know I can take care of myself. I spent 6 months feeling helpless and desperate, and I never want to feel that way again. I need to know that if I choose to be with you, it's because I want to, not because I need to. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret threw herself into job, searching with a determination she hadn't felt in months. She updated her resume, reached out to former colleagues, and applied for social work positions throughout the city. She also started looking into resources for single mothers, researching childcare options and financial assistance programs. Lisa watched her friend's transformation with admiration and concern. You know, she said one evening as they made dinner, together, running away from David doesn't prove you don't need him. It might just prove that you're too scared to find out if you actually want him. I'm not running away, Margaret protested. I'm being practical. I'm making sure I can survive on my own before I make any decisions about my future. But what if survival isn't enough? What if you want more than just getting by? Margaret didn't have an answer for that question. Meanwhile, David was facing his own crisis. His father's health was deteriorating rapidly, though Richard was trying to hide it from everyone except his doctors. David could see the signs, the fatigue, the weight loss, the way Richard sometimes struggled to catch his breath. During conversations, one evening David confronted his father in his office. How long do you have? He asked directly. Richard looked up from the papers he was reviewing. What are you talking about? Don't lie to me, Dad. I know you're sick. I've known for weeks. How long did the doctors give you? Richard was quiet for a long moment, then set down his pen. 6 months, maybe less. My heart is failing and there's nothing more they can do. David felt the air leave his lungs. Even though he had suspected the truth, hearing it confirmed was devastating. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to make sure you were settled first. I wanted to know that you'd have someone to take care of you after I'm gone, and that there would be grandchildren to carry on our family name. So you manipulated Margaret and me into a marriage because you're dying? I brought 2 people together who needed each other, Richard said. The fact that it also solved my problem was just good planning. David stared at his father, feeling a mixture of anger and heartbreak. You could have just told me the truth. I would have understood. I would have wanted to spend this time with you instead of fighting about Margaret and contracts and heirs. Would you? Oh, would you have pitied me and treated me like an invalid for my last months? Before David could answer, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Richard had collapsed in his office that afternoon and was in the emergency room. As David rushed to be with his father, he realized that time was running out for all of them. Richard was dying, Margaret was carrying his child and refusing to see him, and he was caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to honor his father's wishes while following his own heart. The baby would be born into this complicated family, with all its secrets and manipulations and desperate attempts at love. But maybe, David thought as he drove through the city streets, that was okay. Maybe every family was complicated, and maybe the best they could do was try to love each other. Honestly. Even when the circumstances weren't perfect, the question was whether Margaret would give them all the chance to find out. Margaret was making breakfast at Lisa's apartment when David called with the news about Richard being in the hospital. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite all her confusion and anger, her first instinct was to go to him. "You don't have to do this," Lisa said as Margaret grabbed her coat. "You don't owe that family anything." "I know," Margaret replied. "But David is still my husband, and Richard is still the father of my baby's grandfather. Some things are bigger than hurt feelings." The hospital corridors smelled like disinfectant and sadness, bringing back painful memories of the months she had spent watching Tom fade away. She found David in the cardiac care waiting room, sitting with his head in his hands, looking more alone than she had ever seen him. "How is he?" Margaret asked, sitting down beside him. David looked up in surprise. "Margaret? What are you doing here?" "I heard what happened. I wanted to make sure you were okay." "He's stable for now," David said. "But the doctors say his heart is failing faster than they expected. They think he has maybe a few weeks, not months." Margaret reached over and took David's hand. Whatever was happening between them, he shouldn't have to face this alone. "I'm sorry. I know you two have had your problems, but losing a parent is never easy." "The worst part is all the time we wasted fighting," David said. "He was dying, and instead of spending time together, we were arguing about contracts and arrangements. And whether my marriage was real enough to suit his plans? Maybe it's not too late to change that," Margaret said gently. They sat together in the waiting room for hours, talking quietly about David's childhood memories of his father, the good times before grief and business pressures had driven them apart. Margaret found herself seeing Richard differently through David's stories, not just as the manipulative businessman who had orchestrated their marriage, but as a man who had lost his wife young and had never quite figured out how to balance love and control. When the doctor finally said they could see Richard, he looked smaller and frailer than Margaret had ever seen him. The powerful man who had commanded rooms and closed million-dollar deals was now connected to machines, his face pale and drawn. "You came?" he said when he saw Margaret, his voice weak but surprised. "Of course I came," Margaret said, pulling a chair close to his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying," Richard said with a weak smile. "Which, according to the doctors, I am." He looked between Margaret and David. "I suppose you told her the truth about my condition?" "She deserved to know," David said. Richard nodded slowly. "I owe you both an apology. I was so terrified of dying alone, of leaving nothing behind but money and real estate, that I tried to force the things that matter most. Love, family, legacy, those can't be bought or contracted. They have to be chosen freely." "Mr. Hawthorne," Margaret said, "I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant." Richard's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like his old self again. "You're having a baby? My grandchild?" "Yes, but before you get excited, you need to understand something. This baby won't be part of any business arrangement. I'm going to raise my child to know that love and family aren't things you negotiate. For they're things you give freely or not at all." Richard was quiet for a long moment, tears forming in his eyes. "You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry I made it seem like your marriage was just a transaction. Watching you two together these past weeks, anyone could see that what you built was real, regardless of how it started." "Dad," David said, "Margaret and I are going through some difficult times right now." We're trying to figure out if our feelings for each other are genuine or just circumstantial. The pregnancy complicates everything. No, Richard said firmly, using more energy than he probably had. The pregnancy doesn't complicate anything. It clarifies everything. You're going to be parents together. That's a gift, not a complication. The question is whether you're brave enough to build a real family together, based on choice rather than obligation. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself spending more time at the hospital than she had planned. Richard was getting weaker, but he was also becoming more honest and open than she had ever seen him. He told her stories about David's mother, about the early days of building his business, about his regrets and his hopes. "I never learned how to show love without trying to control it," he admitted during one of their conversations. When David's mother was dying, I threw money at every possible treatment instead of just being present with her. When David was growing up, I tried to buy his affection with expensive gifts instead of spending time with him. And when I realized I was dying, I tried to arrange his happiness instead of trusting him to find it himself. It's not too late to change that pattern, Margaret said. David needs his father right now, not his business manager. And what do you need? Richard asked. What would make you happy? Margaret thought about the question seriously. I need to know that I can take care of myself and my baby. I need to know that if I choose to be with David, it's because we love each other, not because either of us feels obligated or grateful or trapped. Fair enough, Richard said. What can I do to help you figure that out? Margaret was surprised by the question. I don't understand. I'm rewriting my will, Richard said. I want to set up a trust fund for your child that you control completely. Regardless of what happens between you and David, I also want to transfer ownership of that house in Maple Grove to you immediately, with no strings attached, if you decide. You don't want to be part of this family, you and your child will still be financially secure. Mr. Hawthorne, I can't accept. Yes, you can, Richard interrupted. This isn't charity or manipulation. This is an old man trying to do the right thing before it's too late. I brought you into this family under false pretenses. The least I can do is make sure you have real choices about your future. That evening, Margaret and David walked through the hospital garden together, talking about Richard's offer and what it meant for their relationship. If you accept his offer, you won't need me for financial security, David said. You'll be free to choose whether you want to be married to me for the right reasons, and if I don't want to be married to you. Margaret asked. David was quiet for a moment. Then I hope you'll still let me be part of our child's life. And I hope you'll know that my love for you was real, even if the circumstances weren't perfect. Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If your father hadn't orchestrated this whole arrangement, if we had just met randomly at a coffee shop or through mutual friends, do you think you would have been interested in me? David looked into her eyes. Yes, absolutely yes. You're intelligent, compassionate, funny, and beautiful. You care about the same things I care about. You make me want to be a better person. I would have been interested in you under any circumstances. Even if I had been financially stable and not in crisis? Especially then, David said. Because then I would have known that any feelings you had for me were genuine, not influenced by desperation or gratitude. Margaret felt tears starting to fall. I love you, she said. I think I've loved you since that first dinner when you insisted on helping me find housing through nonprofit organizations instead of just going along with your father's scheme. I love your integrity and your kindness and the way you see solutions where other people see problems. I love you too, David said, pulling her into his arms. I love your strength and your heart and the way you refuse to let difficult circumstances make you bitter. I love that you're going to be the mother of my child. They held each other in the hospital garden, both of them crying and laughing at the same time, finally admitting what they had been afraid to say for weeks. Richard passed away peacefully 2 weeks later, with David and Margaret by his side. In his final days, he had become the father and father-in-law they had always needed him to be, present, loving and supportive without trying to control their choices. The baby was born 6 months later, a healthy girl with David's dark eyes and Margaret's determined chin. They named her Hope, because she represented the possibility of building something beautiful from the most unlikely circumstances. As Margaret held her daughter for the first time, with David beside her and Helen fussing over them both, she realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst situations. Her marriage to David had started as a business arrangement, but it had become the greatest love story of her life. They had learned that real love isn't about perfect circumstances or dramatic declarations. It's about choosing each other every day, through complications and confusion, through fear and hope, through the ordinary moments that make up a life together. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy Richard could have left them. Not his money or his real estate empire, but the knowledge that love, when it's real, can survive anything, even the strangest beginning imaginable.